right, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Monster Monday. My name is DM Galabond, and this is going to be a weekly show where we talk about a monster from the lore of D&D. We'll do an in-depth look at some of the history and features of a monster, and we'll talk a little bit about how, as a DM, you can use the monster in your campaigns, and even how you can reskin it to make it something that your players may not have ever seen before. Tonight's monster that we're looking at is an oldie but a goodie. It is the Gelatinous Cube. And slide, please. Okay. As I said, my name is DM Galabond. I have several other shows that appear on this here Twitch channel. On Saturdays at noon Eastern Time, I host an actual play show called The History of D&D, where we are playing original D&D, so way back, the version that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax put together. Back before there was such a thing as AD&D. I like to say that this is the version that was so poor they only had 3 alignments. It's also the version where dwarf, elf, and halfling were classes. They did not separate the demi-human races from the classes in this edition. You had to qualify to play a demi-human by having scores that were high enough. And then Sunday, I do a 5th edition game called The Walker of Waterdeep, and that is Sundays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The Walker of Waterdeep is a show that crosses the streams, just like they told us not to do in Ghostbusters, but we cross the streams with the lore of Magic the Gathering and 5th edition D&D. And that game has been going for several months now, and we run it every Sunday. And then Tuesday nights at 8 p.m., I do a show called Tuesdays from the Table. It's another one mic show where I recap what happened in the Saturday History of D&D game and the Sunday Walker of Waterdeep game. All right. And now, a little bit about this show. What exactly is Monster Monday? Monster Monday is a new weekly one mic show where I'll discuss a particular D&D monster in depth. We'll talk about several different facets of the monster. We'll talk about its physical description. So what does a monster look like? What are some good adjectives that you can use to describe it for your party, as though the players may not recognize it just in the same way that the characters may not? So how can you build that suspense? Then the creature type. What type of creature is it? What are the common traits of these creatures? The terrain. What type? Where does the monster live? Where will you encounter it, in air quotes, in the wild? And where else might you find this monster? Then there's flavor features. This is what I like to think of as non-mechanical features of the monster. So what are features that add some mystique or unique qualities to the monster, but don't really impact its actual attacks, damage, or actions? And then there are the mechanical features of the monster. So what are some hallmark mechanical features? Does it have any special abilities to help its allies or hinder its enemies, for instance? Then we'll talk a little bit about its attacks and special abilities. So what kind of attacks does the monster have? Does it have any attacks that don't do physical damage, but that help the monster or its allies more effectively fight their enemies? Then we'll look at the monster in other editions. So what is the history of this monster? How has it changed from edition to edition over the course of the many editions of D&D since the game was first introduced? We'll talk about using the monster in campaigns. So if you're building a homebrew campaign, how could you use this monster? Would it pose a menace, or would it be just a speed bump for your PCs? And are there any unusual or unexpected ways you can use the monster? And tonight has a really good example of that with the gelatinous cube. And then finally, reskinning the monster. Um, Delight and terrify your players. So, how can you take a stat block for a familiar monster and change it into something completely different? What are some ideas you could have? Now, this particular segment will never be comprehensive, but it might spur some ideas on additional ways to reskin or change the monster's appearance while still leveraging its stat block for the sake of a balanced encounter. And whoops, and tonight's monster, as I said, is the gelatinous cube. And we'll take a look at a description of the gelatinous cube. Basically, a gelatinous cube is a large ooze. Um, and when I say large, I mean it's about 10 feet on each side. So 6 sides, 10 feet each. That makes it pretty big. Now, this next fact is something that I saw from the Forgotten Realms wiki. That's a pretty popular site, so I went ahead and put it in, but I don't know how reliable it is. It's a very heavy ooze. According to that wiki, a gelatinous cube can weigh up to 50,000 pounds or up to 23,000 kilograms. Now, I've never imagined the thing being quite that heavy, but I have no idea whether it would be or whether it wouldn't be. Frankly, I've never tried to make a cube of Jello 10 feet on a side, so I have no idea how big such a thing would be. Gelatinous cubes, they are silent scourers. They silently go through dungeon passages. One thing that's kind of key here is that they move in silent, predictable patterns, and they leave behind perfectly clean paths in their wake. They consume living tissue while leaving bones and other materials undissolved. And another trait of these creatures is that they're all but transparent. Um, that makes it very hard to spot until it attacks. But a cube that's well fed can be easier to spot since its victim's bones, coins, and other objects may be seen suspended inside the creature. Now, this gets a little bit into our next, one of our other things. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's look at the type of creature. The creature type. Gelatinous cube is an ooze. And oozes are a family of creature that share the following traits. And this is right out of the monster manual. Okay, as you'll notice, I'm not mentioning it, but I have on the stream credits for every place that I'm getting these images. Most of these images come from Pixabay, which is a great site that has a lot of free images. And if there are any images that are out of an edition of the Monster Manual or some other reference, I put a link to where you can find those as well. So let's look at the properties of oozes. Oozes thrive in the dark. They shun areas of bright light and extreme temperatures. They flow through the damp underground, feeding on any creature or object that can be dissolved, slinking along the ground, dripping from walls and ceilings, spreading across the edges of underground pools, and squeezing through cracks. The first warning you might have of an ooze's presence is the searing pain when its acidic body touches you. Now, oozes are also drawn to movement and warmth. Organic material nourishes them, and when prey is scarce, they feed on grime, fungus, and offal. Veteran explorers know that an immaculately clean passageway is likely a sign that an ooze lair is nearby. Then they offer a slow death. An ooze kills its prey slowly. Some varieties, like our friend the gelatinous cube and black puddings, will engulf creatures to prevent them escaping. The only upside of this torturous death is that a victim's comrades can come to the rescue before it's too late. And not every ooze can digest every type of substance. So many, like our friend the gelatinous cube, have coins, metal gear, bones, and other debris suspended within their quivering bodies. If a party manages to slay an ooze, it can be a rich source of treasure for its killers. And then there's a fact about ooze nature. Oozes do not require sleep. Okay. Are they uncommon? Asks Tony. Well, the fifth edition monsters are actually fairly common in dungeons, but we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of where they, what kind of terrain they involve, or where they're found. Now, in the wild, the oozes actually come from the Underdark. Lore about the oozes says that they are spawns of Jubilex, which is the demonic lord of oozes. So from the abyss, they can sometimes make their way to the Underdark, and from the Underdark, they can at times be lured into or relocated to other areas, namely manufactured dungeons, or constructed dungeons, I should say. They can be, when they're found there, they can be unwitting servants. An ooze itself lacks much of any intelligence to ally itself with other creatures, but other more intelligent creatures understand that an ooze's need to feed might lure it into a location where it can be of use to them. Clever monsters may keep oozes around to defend passageways or to consume refuse. Likewise, an ooze can be enticed into a pit trap where its captors feed it often enough to prevent it from coming after them. And then when the unsuspecting adventurer walks by and falls into the trap, hey, that's an extra meal for the ooze. And sometimes crafty creatures place torches and flaming braziers in strategic areas to dissuade an ooze from leaving a particular tunnel or room. You light something up, the ooze is not going to want to go that way, so it stays in the dark. And if you have a dark passage or a dark set of passages in between two lit areas, you can kind of keep the ooze sort of fenced in, kind of like an electric fence for your dog, if you will, but it becomes a light fence for the gelatinous cube, if you will. Now we will get into some of the flavor features of the ooze. The gelatinous cube, or I'm sorry, of the gelatinous cube. The gelatinous cube is nearly transparent, and except for any undigestible matter that may be contained inside it. Now, as a DM, this can give you a great opportunity to paint an image for a party of a shape that looks like a breastplate of armor or a shield that's simply floating in the air on the edge of your torchlight further down a corridor. Or perhaps you could see the glint of something like treasure. Maybe there's something that sparkles like a magic ring, and it's just hanging suspended in the air a few yards away. Hey, you know you want to go to it. You know you want to reach out to it. You want to take hold of it. It's been a really tough adventure, and there's free treasure right there. Go on. What's the worst that could happen? You know you want to reach out and grab it. Another sort of flavor feature of the gelatinous cube are its spotless, clean trails. If the party is traveling through a dungeon, there may be, most passages, there's going to be things like dust, occasional pebbles, or the bones of small animals, or the husks of mundane insects that are there, maybe the droppings of like rats or things like that. But then you might come across a corridor that's completely spotless and absolutely cleaned, as though someone had just finished sweeping or mopping it. And a really observant party, they might notice, hey, wait a minute, there's something different about this. What's going on here? Why is this passage cleaned when the rest of them aren't? Is there something significant about it? Let's go check it out. And that gives you as an opportunity to go in. Yeah, never trust the phrase, "What's the worst that can happen?" Yeah, I agree with that, Gonti. Um, that is very, very true. Um, or as the T-shirt says, "When the DM smiles, it's already too late." All right. Mechanical features of the gelatinous cube. All right. So, what makes this monster tick? What makes your gelatinous cube tick? First of all, it's an ooze cube. So that means it takes up the entire space. Let's say it's a 10-foot by 10-foot hallway. That means a 10-foot gelatinous cube is going to fill it up wall to wall. You can't squeeze around it. You can't go over it. I mean, I suppose depending on how high the ceiling is, you might be able to fly over it, or if you have some other way of leaping over it. And obviously, if you can do something like a ethereal step, you can get around it that way. But that means you have to know it's there. Other creatures can enter the space of the gelatinous cube, but any creature that does so is subjected to the cube's engulf um, attack and has disadvantage on its saving throws if you voluntarily move into the space of a gelatinous cube. And that includes voluntarily moving in even when you don't know it's there. The gelatinous cube, and this is a 5th edition gelatinous cube, is transparent. Even when the cube is in plain sight, it takes a successful DC 15 wisdom perception check to spot a cube that has neither moved nor attacked. A creature that tries to enter the cube space while unaware of the cube is surprised and has the surprise condition. Now, the cube is surprisingly resilient. It has a lot of condition immunities. And again, this is the 5th edition cube. And this is one of the things I found in my research that was so interesting about the evolution of the cube. But in 5th edition, Gelatinous Cube is immune to being blinded, charmed, deafened, exhausted, frightened, or knocked prone. It also has blind sight out to 60 feet and passive perception of 8. So passive perception of 8, that means like if you're really sneaky, you can probably get around it if somehow you recognize it's there. It's not going to be terribly aware of you, but it is so hard to detect that um, odds are that a lot of things are just going to simply bumble right into it, and it's going to be able to take advantage of that. And also with the fact that it has blind sight, that means even if it's completely dark, it can kind of detect uh, where its prey may be, or where likely prey may be. So now let's take a look at the attacks and special abilities. And yes, there's a reason that I have this particular image up. Okay. Its first attack, and again, this is 5th edition attack, is a pseudopod. So that's a melee weapon attack. It just takes a piece of its body, kind of like a snail, and reaches out and smacks you with it. +4 to hit, reach 5 feet, attacks one creature, and it deals 3d6 acid damage if it hits you. But probably the most terrifying of the attacks is the engulf. So the cube can move up to its speed, which is 15 feet per round. And while doing so, it can enter the space of a large or smaller creature. And whenever the cube enters a creature's space, the creature must make a DC 12 dexterity saving throw. If it succeeds on the save, it's pushed back 5 feet or to the side of the cube, depending on the size of the corridor there. A creature that chooses not to be pushed suffers the consequences of a failed saving throw. So on a failed save, the creature gets engulfed, and it takes 3d6 acid damage as soon as it makes contact with the creature. But on every round thereafter that it is engulfed, that jumps up to 6d6 acid damage every round. And while a creature is engulfed, it can't breathe, it's restrained, and it moves along with the cube. So whenever the cube moves, anything that's engulfed inside of it moves along with it. So this is this is probably what makes the gelatinous cube so horrifying, is just the thought of having it just engulf you and then start to eat you away inside while everybody can see that happening. If you get engulfed by a gelatinous cube, you can be seen, but you are presumed to have total cover. So you're impervious to any attacks from the outside, but of course you're being attacked by the digestive juices of the cube itself. And in 5th edition, a cube can hold one large creature, but it can hold up to 4 medium creatures at the same time. So if you have one poor schlub from the party that gets engulfed, and then his 3, klutzy friends try to pull him out, they can get engulfed too. And now you can have 4 of your party members stuck inside this stupid thing. Escaping the cube. A creature that is within 5 feet of the cube can take an action to pull a creature or object out. Doing so requires a successful DC 12 strength check, and the creature making the attempt takes 3d6 acid damage while trying to pull somebody out of the cube. And then we go, the special damage type is acid, and that's why we have this image here, because it's not the long, strange trip type of acid. It's the, oh, I'm burning, ow, ow, ow kind of acid. And this acid makes what appears to be a harmless looking and sometimes even a funny sounding creature, a gelatinous cube, makes it a deadly and terrifying foe. And the fact that this monster deals special damage also gives us some clues. Later on, we'll talk about when it comes to reskinning the monster and how you can create new monsters with a similar CR that look and feel totally different, but otherwise have exactly the same mechanical stat block. All right. Yeah. So yeah, 4 people. That's that's pretty terrifying. So now we're going to go and we're going to take a look at gelatinous cubes and other editions. The gelatinous cube has been around with us since the days of original D&D. It goes all the way back to then. It appears both in the rules cyclopedia for original D&D and in the 1st edition AD&D monster manual. So back in original D&D, the gelatinous cube was a 4-hit dice monster that moved at 20 feet per round. Now that sounds like it's a little faster, but in those days a round was 10 seconds. And in 5e, of course, a round is 6 seconds. So there used to be 6 rounds in a minute, but these days there are 10 rounds in a minute. So The 20 and 15, that's pretty close to the same speed. Um, and in the original D&D edition, the cube forced a saving throw versus paralysis. So if the character failed, it was paralyzed for 2d4 turns. Okay, now, you guys, if you've only played D&D, you don't understand how absolutely debilitating that is. A turn is a mechanical term for a unit of 10 minutes of game time. So if you are paralyzed for 2d4 turns, that means from 20 to 80 minutes, you are simply paralyzed by this thing. You can't do anything. Um, and the monster would then go about killing everyone else in the area, and then it would come back and devour them all at its leisure. So, you could imagine your character getting paralyzed and then watching it as it goes and paralyzes your other party members, and then it gradually comes back and decides, okay, now it's gonna engulf you and start to digest you. Um, that's just that's just kind of terrifying if you think about that. Now, in the first edition, it had immunities to cold and lightning, but otherwise it could be harmed by fire and weapons. And you notice all those other spell effects that we talked about with the fifth edition, it didn't say anything about those. So theoretically, you could you might be able to charm it, you might be able to put it to sleep, you might be able to, there's a whole lot of things you might be able to do to it that you can't do in fifth edition because the rules didn't say anything about it. So now if we look at advanced D&D or first edition D&D, the gelatinous cubes remain largely the same as they were in the original version. There was, however, a slight difference in their defenses. In AD&D, cold would have no effect unless they failed their saving throw. If they failed their saving throw, they were slowed by 50%, and any cold attack would deal only 1 to 4 points of damage, regardless of how much cold you threw at it in any one attack. Electricity, fear, holds, paralysis, polymorph, and sleep-based attacks had no effects on gelatinous cube in first edition, the AD&D. So that's kind of where you started to see all those other resistances. Original D&D was mum on that, but by first edition or AD&D, they began to figure that out. So let's see. In second edition, now here is from the second edition Monstrous Manual, a depiction of the gelatinous cube. So in this edition, the cube attacks with anesthetizing slime. And so that meant that you had to make a save versus paralysis, or you were paralyzed for 5d4 rounds. Now, that first edition, it was 2d4 turns, a turn being 10 minutes of time. A round by second edition, now I can't recall when the switch happened, when it went from 10 seconds to 6 seconds, but even presuming 10-second rounds, 20 rounds is 200 seconds. So that's barely over 3 minutes. So the amount of time that you were paralyzed by this thing greatly was reduced. But of course, if it's engulfing you and doing damage to you, it doesn't really need to take that long. So the cube would immediately surround its prey and secrete digestive fluids to absorb the food. All damage is caused by these digestive fluids. So in that second edition, it's important that when it first hit you, you didn't take any damage. It wasn't until it started to engulf you that you would take damage because of those digestive fluids. Gelatinous cubes are difficult to see. So Everyone else has a -3 on their surprise roll. Electricity, fear, holds, paralysis, polymorph, and sleep attacks have no effect on the monster. Fire and blows from weapons have normal effects. And once again, like the AD&D version, if it fails its saving throw against a cold-based attack, it'll be slowed by 50%, and cold attacks only inflict 1 to 4 points of damage. So, so that was the second edition cube. Now, third edition. Third edition is saw yet another change, and this is the image of the gelatinous cube from, I believe it's the third edition monster manual. So in this case, it was classified as a huge creature, and third edition brought in the CR, so the crit rating or whatever it is, the challenge rating. I'm sorry, CR, the challenge rating, and it was a CR3 monster, a huge creature. This particular version, it moves at 15 feet, just like the 5e version, and it still has the engulf attack. Special abilities also changed a little bit with this edition. In this edition is when it first started to attack by slamming its body into its prey with the pseudopod. So it's capable of lashing out, but it usually engulfs its foes. It gained. They talked about it being acid damage instead of digestive fluids in this particular edition, and they specified that the gelatinous cube's acid does not harm metal or stone. Now, anyone who's examined the various family of oozes knows that there's some that will devour metal, some that will devour wood, some that will devour flesh, and so on and so forth. So they specified with this one that it would not harm metal or stone. And it had the engulf attack, as we talked about. It moves slowly, but it can simply mow down large or smaller creatures as a standard action. It cannot make a slam attack during a round in which it engulfs. The gelatinous cube merely has to move over opponents, affecting as many as it can cover. So if it comes on a sleeping party, it can just simply go over all of them, the entire party, and engulf all of them as it goes, presuming they don't wake up, or presuming they aren't able to wake up. Those who do not attempt attacks of opportunity. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Opponents can make an opportunity attack against the cube, but if they do so, they're not entitled to a saving throw. And those who do not attempt attacks of opportunity must succeed on a DC 13 reflex save or be engulfed. On a success, they're pushed back or aside, the opponent's choice, as the cube moves forward. Engulfed creatures are subject to the cube's paralysis and acid and are considered to be grappled and trapped within its body. The save DC is strength-based, and it includes a +1 bonus, a +1 racial bonus for the ooze. And paralysis, the cube secretes an anesthetizing slime, just like in second edition. Target hit by a cube's melee or engulf must succeed on a DC 20 fortitude save or be paralyzed for 3d6 rounds. So now you're down to a maximum of 18 rounds from 20 rounds in the edition before. The cube can automatically engulf a paralyzed opponent, and that DC is Constitution based. So if you are a high Constitution character, you get to obviously use that in your saving throw. Oh, and this is the 3.5 monster manual. I couldn't find. I was looking through, and I couldn't find an actual third edition monster manual. There's probably one out there, but I couldn't find it. Over the years, last few years, I bought a lot of the older edition manuals from uh, DM's Guild, so I can have them all uh, in PDF format so that I can easily search and find different things. And I didn't see a third edition monster manual in my collection, so I went out onto DM's Guild and I couldn't find one there either. So I don't know whether they just decided that the 3.5 is close enough or whether they never maybe made one for actually third edition. So now we move to fourth edition, and fourth edition was the crazy edition. It's the edition where they allowed themselves to be inspired by video games. And so you had all kinds of weird mechanics and weird sorts of values that were in fourth edition D&D. This is an image from the fourth edition monster manual. And in this edition, it became a level 5 brute or elite brute. Now, a brute was a type of creature that hit pretty hard and had a crap ton of hit points. It was not really intended to be like a solo monster, but it was intended, especially as an elite brute, to be sort of the mini boss within a group encounter. So you could put it out there on its own, and it would be kind of a moderate challenge for a party of the correct level. But if you added a couple of other low level monsters along with it, then it became like a really tough challenge for a party of the appropriate level. Um, and the creature gained a lot of armor class. Most other editions say that the armor class is somewhere around uh, 6 or 8 or something like that. And in fourth edition, the armor class became 18. Now, as you go up in levels in fourth edition, armor classes for everybody become just insane. So that's not really all that far out of the realm of possibility. And it also gained a crap ton of hit points. In fourth edition, I want to say that that the HP, well, it probably tripled from what it had been in third edition. It was over 150 hit points for a gelatinous cube in fourth edition. And it had its bloodied value, I think, at 76. And bloody was an actual mechanic in fourth edition, not for every monster, but for some monsters and for some classes of characters. When you got down to half your hit points, sometimes special abilities would kick in that would only be available once the creature or the character was at half hit points or below. That wasn't the case with the gelatinous cube. It didn't have any of those because it's kind of interesting that was one of the ones that did not have it. In this edition, they specified that it can engulf 2 medium creatures simultaneously. Most of the other ones that say anything about it just give you the impression that it can engulf one thing at a time. But this one, it said it could engulf 2 creatures simultaneously. And its immunities really got nerfed in fourth edition. The only thing it's immune to is gaze attacks. Now, I have no idea why the heck gaze attacks would mean anything to a gelatinous cube, but if you had your pet Medusa with you, she couldn't turn into stone. But otherwise, it didn't have any immunities. So you could attack it with pretty much anything that you wanted to do with it. Now, the only other resistance that it had was resist 10 acid. And in fourth edition, resistance is a little bit different than it is in fifth edition. In fourth edition, it means that that if you attack it with acid, it ignores the first 10 points of damage. So you have to hit it with an acid attack that will do at least 11 points of damage in order to do any damage to the gelatinous cube. And I find it really crazy that it would be able to take any damage from acid at all, seeing as how that it uses acid to digest and to kill its enemies. So you would think that it would sort of, always be, uh, a problem for it, and it should be immune. Now we get to some of the fun part. How do you use a gelatinous cube in a campaign if you're a DM? Now this is an image from D&D Beyond, and I chose this image because it's a very specific cube that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Obviously, if you're traveling in the Underdark, the native habitat of the gelatinous cube, you can put them in there. They might be, some tunnel that's not used by the Drow or the Duergar or any of the other denizens of the Underdark, and you might find a gelatinous cube in there, or you might find an entire nest of gelatinous cubes, which that would be really terrifying. That's one obvious place where you can find it. And another place that you might find it is in a dungeon where it has either been lured or where it has been taken and raised by an intelligent resident or some architect to perform some kind of function. Now, let's just imagine how you're building your campaign and a couple of different types of creatures that might choose to use a gelatinous cube. Now, I know a couple of the people that are on the stream tonight, and thank you, Luis, thank you, Gonti, and thank you, Tony, for dropping by. You guys may or may not be old enough to remember a TV show called Monk. Now, Monk was I believe he was a detective for the police, and he was a germaphobe. So he was always having these, like these little hand sanitizer, these little sanitizing wipes that he would have to wipe down everything before he could touch it. Now, you can imagine as a DM setting up an NPC wizard. And this wizard might be an adversary of the party or might be even an ally or an acquaintance of the party who also is a germaphobe. And that wizard might decide that a really good way to keep his lair clean is to have gelatinous cubes. And he might have figured out how he can keep them confined in ways that we talked about, where you strategically use areas of light to keep them in a certain area. But then he has them just going around cleaning all the floors so they're spotless all the time. So you might have a little bit of a quirk with your NPC that may want to use gelatinous cubes. Also, if you're putting a gelatinous cube in an encounter, depending on whether it's by itself or in tandem with other monsters, could determine how tough it is. Now, let's think about a different situation where there is a fairly sophisticated dungeon that employs humanoid guards, magical traps, or magical alarms, and creatures that can help to destroy intruders. So let's say there's an area of a dungeon where when the party walks into it, it triggers an alarm that your, let's call them hobgoblins, because I believe hobgoblins are the ones that are really sneaky goblinoids. So let's say that an alarm goes off in the area where the hobgoblin guards are. So they know that enemies have gone into that area. They also know that there's a gelatinous cube down there somewhere. And they can go sneaking around, find the party, and get behind them and wait until they have the party in between the hobgoblins on one side and the gelatinous cube on the other. And then if the party gets close enough, they can maybe bull rush with shields or something and try to push the party into the gelatinous cube. So now you have one of the members of the party that's starting to get engulfed by the gelatinous cube, and the other members of the party are getting beat on by these hobgoblins. What do? Do you worry about the hobgoblins? Do you try to get your comrade out? You're taking damage from both sides, and now you're not worried just about that engulf. You're worried about those other enemies as well, and maybe they are raising an alarm and bringing even more reinforcements to come help them fight the party that's intruders. So you can really turn that into a very deadly campaign without, or a very deadly encounter without ramping up the CR of any of the monsters that are in there. And it can be kind of a devious little way of using that. Now, the reason we have this particular image up here is because of a way that the gelatinous cube has been used in one of the 5e published modules. Now, this particular gelatinous cube actually has a name. It's called Glabagool. And Glabagool he appears in the published adventure Out of the Abyss. So in one of the side quests at fairly low level, the party could run into a gelatinous cube with a personality. Now, we talked about how lore says that these guys were the spawn of Jubilex, and the storyline of Out of the Abyss has to do with the demon lords being summoned into the Underdark. One of the consequences of Jubilex being summoned into the Underdark is that this particular cube was given consciousness. And so it has sentience, and its sentience becomes curiosity about the outside world. Chris Perkins has said, both in the written notes inside the module and in other interviews that he's done, he said that a big inspiration for Out of the Abyss was Alice in Wonderland. And you can sort of see little elements of that kind of crazy, whimsical, and yet at the same time terrifying sort of storyline that Lewis Carroll had written with Alice in Wonderland. And Glabagool perfectly fits into that. He's completely unexpected. He follows the party around kind of like a 6-year-old. Oh, where are you from? Oh, what's the surface like? Oh, hey, you just killed that goblin. Can I eat its corpse? Oh, and it's like you have this 6-year-old and he doesn't want to go away. It's like you're being followed around by a puppy that is a gelatinous cube, and it talks to you telepathically the entire time you're in its area. And it's not aggressive towards the adventurers unless they attack it, and then of course it will try to defend itself. So that's kind of can give you an idea of one way you might use it in a really unusual way. Another thing that I thought of is, imagine a civilization where gelatinous cubes are somehow infused with some sort of limited sentience by wizards, and they're used as like after hours janitorial staff. So imagine that you go into government buildings or museums or things like that, and there's gelatinous cubes that are going around and cleaning the floors. Maybe they have some sort of, for lack of a better word, some sort of clothing or something on them that makes them visible. And if they have some sort of limited sentience, maybe they have been bred so that they will kind of ask questions of people they don't recognize. And then if people turn out to be intruders, well, of course, well, we'll just clean you up along with the rest of the trash. And they just kind of engulf you and go on about their business. So that could be a different way of using a gelatinous cube in in an adventure. And now we come to one of my real fun uh, parts of this show is reskinning the monster. Now, this is a really cool thing I found because this one actually comes into my idea for a gelatinous cube. Um, Now, think about reskinning the gelatinous cube as something of a smoke or fog monster. So imagine that you have a part of your adventure where you're sending your party into an area that has a lot of volcanic activity, or it's near a portal to the plane of fire or something, and there's all these areas where dark black smoke is billowing around. And you walk through several clouds of smoke and it's just sort of soot and ash. Well, then another cloud of smoke maybe drifts towards you, and when it hits you, instead of being a normal cloud of ash, now it becomes this cloud of fire, fiery smoke that just starts to engulf you, and it doesn't do acid damage to you, but it does fire damage to you as it starts to just ooze around you. So it acts like an ooze, but it's made of smoke. And you can use exactly the same stat block, give it the same hit points, give it the same number of attacks, give it the same um, abilities, but just change the damage type and maybe change some of its immunities to make sense for something that's um, in a fire-based environment, as opposed to the Underdark, or as opposed to something that's a traditional ooze. And then by the same token, you might be in an alpine area, high mountains where there's fog and clouds and stuff like that. And you walk through these little drifting wisps of clouds. Well, then one of these wisps of clouds comes, and instead of you just kind of passing through it like a cloud, it starts to envelop you and it starts to deal cold damage to you, and it starts to just leach all of the heat out of you, um, with the same kind of um, same rate of damage that a gelatinous cube does. Again, you can take the exact same stat block, so it's the same CR. You can just swap it out, change the damage type, change some of its immunities, do things like that, and it would then be a completely new, completely different monster, and yet you don't have to do a whole lot of work to figure out whether it's too tough or too easy for your party, because you know exactly what the CR is, and in the budget for building your encounter, you can build it just like you would with an existing monster. So that's one way. Fire damage, cold damage. Now also think of planar menaces. So if you have an adventure that takes your characters to different planes, you might have variants that, instead of dealing acid damage, would deal like radiant damage. If you're somewhere like in the astral plane, maybe there's like this crazy sparkling field that just comes up, and then it kind of oozes around and engulfs your your PCs, and it begins to deal radiant damage to it as it does it. Or if you're going into something like the Shadowfell, maybe there's ooze type creatures that deal necrotic damage, and it's like a gelatinous cube that it takes some sort of weird form in the Shadowfell and could do necrotic damage to your creatures. Once again, you just change the damage type, you change a couple of its immunities to make it make sense and make it fit with the environment that it's in, and you can really turn a traditional and familiar creature into something completely different. Yeah, zombie ooze, exactly, Gonti. Really, really like that. Um, And yes, Luis, could you reskin the cube to be a shadow creature along those lines? Yeah, absolutely you could. You could make it a creature of shadow and have it deal, um, necrotic damage or cold damage or whatever you might want it to be. Um, all right, and now I wasn't sure whether how many people we would have on the stream tonight, but we've got 4 people now watching. That's great. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. So, what other questions do you have about the gelatinous cube, or what ideas has this inspired you for how you might be able to use this monster? Okay, Tony asks, can a cleric turn a zombie ooze? Well, if you uh, if you decide as the DM that the creature type is undead, um, I'm not sure that in the rules as written in 5th edition, I'm not sure if there are any creatures, I can't think of any off the top of my head, that are simultaneously 2 different creature types, but that doesn't mean it can't exist. So you might decide, hey, yes, it is both an undead and it's an ooze, and therefore it would be susceptible to things like a cleric's turning ability. Or you might just decide it looks like an oozed, but it's actually undead, and so it has the undead properties. So you would just swap out that suite of features that an ooze gets and replace those with the suite of features that an undead creature type gets. Some of them are the same. They both don't need to sleep. They're both, I think, um, immune to several different types of damage that are the same. There's a kind of a Venn diagram of overlap of their immunities. All right, Luis, Radioactive Clown asks, could you use it for humor in a way like your example of eating a party member while battling another group of monsters, that it can also eat one of the monsters, like a goblin or an orc? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you could, if you have a clever party, you could actually turn the ooze against its allies. Like we said, there's really nothing. An ooze doesn't have any sentience normally, and it doesn't have the ability to make decisions about having allies or anything. So if your clever party is able to go and get the ooze to attack the creatures, or lure the creatures in some way into the path of the ooze, or maybe immobilize the creatures in the path of the ooze, and then the ooze goes and it can destroy the very allies that are trying to use it against the party. So yeah, that's another thing, and that can be kind of a fun way, a fun puzzle type of encounter that you give your party members, where they can find a unique way out. Um, I always find that either when I am sitting in a game at the table as a player, or whether I'm behind the screen running a game as the DM, there's always somebody in the game, some player in the game, that comes up with a completely novel way to approach whatever situation there is that nobody else would think of. And so, I think if you really tried too hard to set up something that had a really specific way of the party overcoming it, then your party may not ever think of it. But if you just throw something out there and you figure, okay, there's a traditional way of getting out of this, your party very well may come up with something completely unique and completely unheard of. It a very memorable encounter, or a very entertaining encounter for everybody involved. Um, Certainly that situation of turning the ooze on its allies and having it gobble up the orc or the goblin or the hobgoblin that's supposed to be with it. Could be fun. Are there any other questions that anyone has about the gelatinous cube? Okay, well, seeing none, this has gone on it's gone on for an hour. I didn't think that I would talk that long. I thought this would be about 30 minutes. But anyway, this has been a fun time. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. And next week we will be back with another edition of Monster Monday. And I think I can actually give you a little hint as to what we are looking at. Unfortunately, I closed that, so I have to reopen it again. And next week, we will actually be talking about an undead called the Bone Claw out of 5th edition. So we'll be looking at the Bone Claw and kind of seeing a little bit about it and its antecedents and where it came from and its history in the game. So, all right, everyone, have a great week. If you all are around tomorrow night, once again at 8 p.m., I will be doing my Tales from the Table, where I really do spend more like a half an hour just recapping the events from the 2 actual play streams that I run on Saturday and Sunday. We're still recruiting for the Saturday game. There's been a flurry of activity with that. So I'm going to say right now we're still recruiting, but when I go and I check my messages on Roll20, we may find that we have a lot of people there. I'm about to experiment with a little bit of a different way of getting players involved with that game. But I don't want to say too much about that now. You can find the history of D&D, which is my original D&D edition game, on Roll20, and that's Saturdays at noon on this very Twitch channel. And then you can find Walker of Waterdeep, which is my game where we cross the streams of the lore between Magic the Gathering and D&D, and that actual play game airs at 2:30 on Sundays on this very Twitch channel. All right, everyone. I hope to see you next week, if not sooner. Have a great night, and we will talk to you later. Until then, watch out for the monsters under the bed.